Welcome, class, to the chapter on sensation and perception, the questions and the senses. In this chapter, we'll be discussing the definitions of sensation and perception. We will be answering the famous questions of sensation, which will look at how the brain has limits on what we can sensate and perceive. Next, we'll look at each of the five senses individually, starting with one of the most valuable senses in psychology, and arguably the most valuable sense, vision and the eye. In this section, we will look at the electromagnetic spectrum, and more specifically, the light spectrum. We will also look at how people conceive color and how color is a construct of the mind. Next, we will look at another valuable sense, hearing and the ear, including sound waves. We will be spending a shorter amount of time on the chemical senses of smell and taste, as well as touch, since they have less importance in terms of psychological relevance. Have you ever watched the movie The Matrix? In the movie, the main character, Neo, is given a glimpse of the Matrix, and then given a choice by Morpheus to take the blue pill or the red pill. He says, "You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill and you stay in Wonderland, and I'll show you how deep the rabbit hole goes." The term red pill refers to a human that is aware of the true nature of the Matrix. The Matrix is an analogy of how our world really is. Not the reality that you know, but the actual reality. The reality outside your limited senses and perception. The reality that you are used to believing and the actual reality beyond your senses and mind are really quite different. Psychology strongly shows us that this is true, and we really don't see the world as it actually is. So get ready, because we are about to take the red pill. Before you can fully understand the true scope of our false reality, there are a few things we need to cover. First, we have to know that the way that we see reality is limited to our senses, mostly vision, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. These are the main ways that we are able to experience what we call reality. The reason why I say what we call reality is because most people trust their senses. We have to. It's part of our survival and a way of living. But our senses are not the only part of experiencing reality. There's perception too. Sensation is defined as the initial gathering of information by the eyes, ears, nose, mouth, and skin, and then recording this information by the sensory structures or receptors. This is a mechanical process done by sampling the information from the outside world and then transmitting the information to our inside world, our brain. It's pretty much the same for most people as long as there's no physical dysfunction like hearing loss or blindness. The false reality part comes in mostly with perception. Once this information is in our brain, we interpret the information into something meaningful. This is perception. Most people trust their perceptions as well, and this is why most people will say that they are sure that they see the world as it really is. But I'm about to tell you that those people are wrong. Perception is defined as the interpretation of the sensory information by the brain. Whereas sensation is a mechanical process, perception is an active, cognitive, and creative process. We interpret what we sense, and this is influenced by a huge list of factors like our thoughts, our expectations, our beliefs, our health, our attitudes, and the list goes on and on. Each one of these factors can skew our reality into something much different than our neighbor. And this is partially how we know that the reality in our mind isn't always the same reality in your neighbor's mind. Just on a side note, knowing this and combining this with empathy is a key to superior social skills. If you can see the world as your neighbor sees it, and then communicate that empathy with understanding and solutions to problems, you can handle most social issues very effectively. What's surprising to most is that both sensation and perception can not offer an exact replica of the world outside of us. You may already know that not all people see the world as it really is, but neither do you. Each person creates their own reality in their mind. In the visual perception section that we will discuss later in the lecture, we will ask the question, what is reality then? And dive deeper into the rabbit hole. For now, let's just look at how the brain subjectively constructs the world using innate and learned assumptions and principles. The tables on the next slide show an example of how the brain misinterprets information coming from our senses and then interprets reality falsely. Take a look at those tables. Are they really the same? The two tables appear to have different dimensions and shapes. Surprisingly, however, they are identical. To convince yourself, you can even measure one of them and compare it to the other. Even knowing this, you cannot make your brain unsee them as being identical. Each of these questions refer to the limits of how the mind will sensate and perceive the world around us. These three questions of detection, difference, and scaling will give us precise measures of the limits of human sensation. So why bother learning this? By using the following criteria, we can accurately predict when a person can detect a stimulus or not. This is very useful in a variety of disciplines, for example, in the military when designing covert aircrafts, or inventing tools for humans in order to improve our lives. Have you ever wondered how good your eyes or ears really are at detecting something? Obviously, most humans vary in their abilities to sense different information. But imagine for a second that you had 20/20 vision and that your hearing was still fully intact. What would be the absolute limit? These questions are answered here. What is the dimmest light we can see or the softest sound that we can hear? Scientists have discovered the answers to these questions using measurements of absolute threshold through the signal detection theory, which we will define on the next slides. The answers? Well, as for our eyes, on a very dark, moonless, clear night, a candle on a mountain can be seen from 30 miles away. As for our ears, in a soundproof room with no sound, the tick of a watch can be heard from 20 feet away. Not too bad, huh? Absolute threshold is defined as the minimum amount of energy in a sensory stimulus that is detected 50% of the time. In the case of detecting a stimulus, we also have subliminal stimulus. Subliminal in this case, meaning it is below threshold. It is defined as a stimulus that is detected only up to 49% of the time, since it must be below the absolute threshold of 50%. What about the literal meaning of subliminal, as in subliminal perception, or perception without your conscious awareness? An example of this is in market advertising, in which there's influences on consumer behavior with subliminal messages. Can TV, music, or other media influence your behavior without your awareness? Effects of subliminal persuasion are short-lived with no long-term behavioral consequences, meaning that there really aren't a lot of influences that your subliminal consciousness will actually have on your actual behavior. Not the same as ESP though, or extrasensory perception. This is where no senses are being used. Although not supported empirically, that doesn't mean that nothing is subconsciously absorbed. We still have information stored in our subconscious. It's just probably not doing much to influence you. like we saw in the split brain research. The filter through which we see the world can be seen in this diagram. What eventually makes it through the filters is much less than what you are consciously aware of. Besides absolute threshold, signal detection theory is also used to answer the detection question, because it must be assumed that the detection of very faint stimuli not only depends on a person's physiological sensitivity, as in how well their eyes or ears work, but also how well they are able to decide and then respond to the detection. On the chart below, you will see the 4 possible outcomes of the scenario. Imagine that you are a participant in an experiment of the detection of a signal light and asked to detect this very faint light from 30 miles away. It is assumed that many participants would sometimes respond wrongly when asked, "Do you see a light?" Let's first start with the correct responses. If the signal light is present and you say, "Yes, I see the signal," then you are correct, and it's a hit. If the signal light is absent and you say, "No, I don't see the signal," then you are correct, and it's a correct rejection. Now let's take a look at incorrect responses. If the signal light is present and you say, "No, I don't see the signal," then you are incorrect, and it's a miss. If the signal light is absent and you say, "Yes, I see the signal," then you are also incorrect, and it's a false alarm. The second question is the difference question. It still has to do with detection ability, but more specifically, how we are able to tell the difference between one stimulus and another. For instance, between the brightness of 2 lights or the loudness of 2 sounds. So the question is, what would be the absolute minimum difference between the 2 stimuli that can be detected at least 50% of the time? Scientists call this the difference threshold, and they use Weber's law to answer this question, which we will define on the next slides. In the case of light brightness, we can detect the difference between 2 lights when there is a 0.08 or 2/25 ratio difference between the 2. And for sound loudness, we can detect the difference between 2 different sounds when there is a 0.05 or 1/20 ratio difference between the 2. Like with the detection question, we had absolute threshold. The difference question has difference threshold, also known as the just noticeable difference, or simply the JND. It is defined as the minimum difference between 2 stimuli that is detected 50% of the time. Scientists use Weber's law to find the JND. There is a lot to Weber's law, but for purposes of this introductory class, just know that Weber's law states that for each type of sensory judgment, the difference threshold is a constant fraction of the standard stimulus value used to measure it. This may sound a little complicated, so let's take a look at a video to see what this means in more simple terms. In the video, they refer to Weber's law as Weber's fraction. They are both essentially the same. This example is on touch difference thresholds, and the fraction is 1/50 or 2%.
The Weber fraction was named after the man who discovered it, a German physiologist with time on his hands named Ernst Weber. In studying touch, he found that the percentage of change necessary to perceive a difference between 2 different lifted weights remained the same across many varying weights. Long story short, he and many others after him determined that the amount of change that can be detected when lifting weights is 2% of the comparison weight. So, for example, pretend you're lifting 100-pound bags of cement. Weber's fraction for weight predicts that if one of the bags had 2 pounds more cement in it, then you'd be able to tell it was heavier. But you could also demonstrate with pennies. Take 50 pennies and weigh them. you'll get 125 grams. That is, if they're all 1982 or newer. Weber's fraction, or the change you'll be able to detect if the comparison sample is 50 pennies, is 2% of 125 grams, or 2.5 grams. So if I take your pennies and bag them into 2 tissues, which is negligible added weight, and I put 50 in one and 51 in the other, and put the 2 bundles of pennies in your outstretched hands, you should be able to tell which one is heavier just by 1 penny difference, or by the Weber fraction for weight for this comparison.
The third and final question is a scaling question. It still has to do with how we perceive the magnitudes or intensities of clearly detectable stimuli. For instance, between the actual physical intensity of a stimuli and our psychological perception of these intensities. So the question is, are we really experiencing the full magnitude of a stimulus? To wrap your head around this concept, we need an example. Imagine that I strap you to an electric chair. Don't worry, I am not sadistic and would never do this to you, but I find this imagery is helpful in remembering the scaling question. Now, let's say I first give you a mild electric shock. You sensate and perceive this shock and rate the intensity on a scale of 0 to 1,000. 0 meaning that you felt nothing at all, and 1,000 being the most horrifying shock you could possibly imagine. Let's say, for demonstration's sake, you rate it a 20. Okay, good. Now I'm going to shock you again, but this time I'm going to shock you at exactly double the intensity of the first shock. I do not tell you this, though. If you are accurate in your scale of magnitude, you should say 40. I give you the shock. Yikes, that was intense. I ask you now to estimate how much more intense the second shock was compared to the first shock. And you, along with the majority of people, rate it as a 200. In the case of perception of magnitude, we humans are not very good at estimating the world around us accurately. Stephen's power law, just like Weber's law and difference thresholds, is a mathematical equation that helps us define human scaling of magnitude in stimuli. Now let's take another look at an aspect of scaling that might actually provide us with the tools to protect us and keep us safe. Have you ever been in a dark classroom and the teacher flicks on the lights on suddenly, and then you hear the ohs and the ahs of people rubbing and squinting their eyes? Or have you ever gotten into a cold pool and after some time the water feels more comfortable and not so cold? Or perhaps you've gone into your friend's room and been walled by an awful smell, but go home to your own house and not smell a thing? These are all examples of sensory adaptation, how our senses adapt to stimuli. Sensory adaptation refers to the disappearance of repetitive or unchanging stimuli in our awareness. Scaling our perceptions has survival value as it is more important to detect new stimuli than constant stimuli. For example, if something changes dramatically in your environment like temperature, especially those that can freeze or burn you, or an electric shock that can kill you, maybe the reason why our perceptions are so skewed is so that we can be aware of dangerous changes in our environment that can hurt or kill us. In terms of light and dark adaptation, we adapt to unchanging stimuli at different rates. We adapt to light much faster than we adapt to dark. It only takes about a minute or so for our eyes to adapt to light, but as much as 45 minutes for our eyes to fully adapt to the dark. In fact, pirates wore eye patches not just for damaged eyes, but also to have one eye adapted to the dark at all times. Now that we have covered some of the limits of our senses, let's now talk a little bit about the individual senses, including how they physically work at the anatomic level, as well as how the information gets transmitted to the brain through the receptors. There is no camera on Earth that is as good as our eyes. Light patterns enter through our narrow opening called the pupil and is controlled by the expansion and contraction of the iris. It travels through the lens and is projected onto a sensitive surface called the retina. The retina contains photoreceptors called rods and cones. These are the sensory receptors for the eye. Rods and cones transmit sensory input back through the bipolar neurons to the ganglion neurons. The axons of the ganglion neurons form the optic nerve. The optic nerve transmits sensory stimulation through the brain to the visual cortex of the occipital lobe. The fovea is the spot where you have the sharpest focus and the densest concentration of cones. Cones transduce color and rods transduce light and dark. The spot where the optic nerve meets the retina is called the blind spot because there are no rods or cones located there. In fact, you can see your blind spot by doing a blind spot test. Let's try it out. To see your blind spot, cover your left eye with your hand and look at the cross. You'll notice that the dot disappears. You may have to slightly move your head slowly back and forth from the screen to see the dot disappear. Make sure you don't take your eyes off the cross. The blind spot is a little offset from your fovea, so if you look at the dot, you will focus on the dot. But by looking at the cross, the dot will disappear. You can even switch by covering your right eye with your hand and looking at the dot to see if the cross will disappear. I was able to get even this larger image to disappear. Maybe you can too. So you may ask yourself, why have I not noticed this very apparent blind spot before? Well, our brains are so amazing at making sense out of nonsense that it is unconsciously filling in the blanks so that you would never notice. As we will see in the visual perception section, our brains do this all the time. We will see more examples of these automatic processes with the visual illusions. As we covered earlier, rods and cones are the visual sensory receptors for vision in the eye. We have many more rods than we do cones. Rods function in dim light, detect black and white vision, and not colors, and are necessary for our peripheral and twilight vision. Cones are concentrated near the center of the retina called the fovea. They function in bright light or daylight and can detect fine detail, and they enable us to see color. You can test your lack of cone concentration in your peripheral vision by doing the next activity. You'll need a friend for this one. You can't tell color well in your peripheral vision. Activity. Step 1. Have a friend find something small of one color, like a crayon or a marker. Avoid very light or very dark colors. Don't let them tell you what it is or what color it is. It's best to find something that they will not know the color of already by shape, meaning don't pick an object that they already know the color of. Step 2. Stand facing forward with something in the distance that you can focus on straight ahead. Do not move your gaze for the entire experiment. Moving your eyes to the side at all will move your fovea, thus ruining the purpose of this experiment. Remember that we are testing your peripheral color vision. Have the friend hold the object off to one side and slightly behind your field of peripheral vision. Like in the diagram in the start position, you stand or sit with your gaze staring straight ahead of you. Do not look to the side. Stretch your arm out and have the friend position the thing at your fingertips. Step 3. Very, very slowly move your arm in an arch toward the center and have your friend follow your hand holding the object at your fingertips. Try to guess the color at the guess points listed in the diagram. Chances are you won't be able to completely be sure of the color until you get at least halfway through the arch. Most people cannot tell the color until it is almost completely in front of them. Now that we've covered how the eye works, let's now look at the properties of light. We cannot see without it. The light that allows us to see color is only a small part of the electromagnetic spectrum. The rest of the spectrum are waves that we cannot see, like ultraviolet light, X-rays, and radio waves, among others. White light is the combination of all colors, and black is the absence of color. This is the opposite to pigments, in which black is the combination of multiple colors and white is the absence of pigments. The spectrum of visible light is split through a prism using white light. The wavelengths of light are related to the perceived color of an object. Visible light has wavelengths from about 400 nanometers to about 700 nanometers. Notice how the wavelengths of the different kinds of light differ. You may perceive a rainbow. You can remember the colors in a rainbow in order by using the mnemonic Roy G. Biv for red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. The physical properties of light are things like color or hue, which is determined by the wavelength, or distance from one peak to the other. Bluish light has short wavelengths and a higher frequency, or repetitions of a wave. Reddish colors have long wavelengths and lower frequencies. Intensity or brightness is determined by the wave's amplitude or height of the wave. Bright colors have high amplitudes and dull colors have lower amplitudes. Can you see the number in the red circle? If you cannot see the number 74, you may be colorblind. Blue, green, and red are the primary colors of light. All other colors are the result of varying activation in red, green, or blue light-sensitive cones. This theory explains the red-green color blindness that some people experience. People with red-green color blindness have blue-sensitive cones, but either their red or green cones are not sensitive or are reduced in their sensitivity. As a result, red and green look the same to a person with red-green color blindness. They generally have difficulty distinguishing between reds, greens, browns, and oranges. They also commonly confuse different types of blue and purple hues. There is also blue color blindness, but this is extremely rare. People with reduced blue sensitivity have difficulty identifying differences between blue and yellow, violet and red, and blue and green. To these people, the world appears generally as red, pink, black, white, gray, and turquoise. For more information on how people with color blindness see the world, go to Blackboard and click on Course Content web links, and look for the link organized by chapter. Have you ever stared at a light and been temporarily blinded by the lasting blur in the shape of that light? If it was a colored light, did you see a different color than the light that you stared at? Opponent process theory explains this effect. It suggests that color perception is controlled by the activity of two opponent systems, a blue-yellow mechanism and a green-red mechanism. For example, while we often see greenish-blue or bluish-reds, we do not see reddish-greens or yellowish-blues. Red creates a positive or excitatory response, while green creates a negative or inhibitory response. An afterimage is a persistent sensation of color that is followed by the perception of the complementary color when the first color is removed. Let's try one out. On the next slide, I will show you an American flag that has complementary colors based off of the opponent process theory. The red and white stripes that you'll expect to see will be green and black, And the box of stars will not be blue and white, but will be yellow and black. Stare at the center of the image for about 30 seconds. Do not move your gaze and try not to blink. It's okay if you go cross-eyed a little. I will then switch the screen to a white background. What you will hopefully see is a normal red, white, and blue American flag after image. Let's try it out. Do you see the American flag? If you're having trouble, try switching your gaze to a wall. It may appear much larger than it did on the slide, and that's okay. If you blink, it should refresh the image, but it slowly will disappear after some time. According to the opponent process theory, there are no such colors as reddish green or bluish yellow, but one recent study thinks that there are. They call them the forbidden colors. Can you see the forbidden colors? Stare at the borders of these two sets of colors side by side. Some people report that they can actually see the new colors when the borders blur into each other. Ask to describe them and you get some difficulty. Although scientists are leaning toward the judgment that these people are really only seeing a muddy intermediate color, the forbidden colors might still exist. Or not. I don't want to sound like that crazy aunt everyone has. How do you describe a color to someone who has never seen it? Imagine trying to describe the color red to someone who is completely blind. How can you describe red? We will all agree that a fire truck, blood, and Mars are all red, but how do you know that the red that you see is the same red that your neighbor sees? Even if you know that your neighbor can identify something as red, doesn't mean that you and he or she sees red as red. Maybe their red looks like your blue. Scientists have since been investigating this and are still unclear. Some lean toward the answer that some people do see colors differently. They are also looking into whether a gene therapy technique given to humans could one day give us a fourth kind of cone cell, such as the ones allowed to see UV sensitive light, like in some birds, potentially allowing us to see more colors. That would look similar to the photo on the left. Or perhaps we might have the ability to see in the dark, like snakes in infrared one day, like the image to the right. The next sense that is of some importance in psychology is hearing. Let's take a quick look at the anatomy of the ear and how sound works. Then take a look at loud sounds and how it can be damaging to our hearing. If a tree falls in the woods and no one is there to hear it, does it still make a sound? What is sound? If you define sound as waves traveling through the air, then I guess you would say yes, it does make a sound. However, many psychologists would say that the sound is a perception of the waves and needs an ear to exist. And so they would say no, there is no sound if no one is there to perceive it. The human ear works like a sound capturing device, cupped to capture sound waves traveling through the air. The waves enter the canal and vibrate the eardrum. The drum vibrates the three smallest bones in the body, the hammer, anvil, and stirrup, so named for how they look. The Latin medical names are malleus, incus, and stapes. These bones then vibrate the liquid in the cochlea, where the cilia or hair cells transduce the message into an electrical signal to our brain, in which we experience as sound. Like light, sound also travels in waves. Sound can vary in terms of pitch and loudness. Pitch is determined by the frequency or repetitions of the wave and is expressed in hertz. 1 hertz equals 1 cycle per second. In the example, lower pitched sounds have fewer cycles, in this case 1, and higher pitched sounds have more cycles, in this case 2 cycles. The pitch of a woman's voice is higher than a man's. This is because women's vocal cords are usually shorter and their vocal cords vibrate at a greater frequency. Loudness or volume is determined by amplitude, or the height of the wave, and is expressed in terms of decibels. In the example, a quiet sound is short and a louder sound is taller. Have you ever been to a concert and had your ears hurt or had trouble hearing for a while afterwards? Loud sounds can damage your hearing permanently. 0 decibels is based on the absolute threshold for hearing, and every 10 decibels corresponds to a tenfold increase in sound intensity. In that case, how much greater is a 60 decibel conversation from a 20 decibel whisper? You are right if your answer is 10,000 times more intense. In the chart, you can see that anything in orange and red is dangerous. The ones in red have guaranteed danger, and the ones in orange must have some length of time exposed to the sound for it to damage your hearing. As a general rule, if you cannot talk over a noise, it is potentially harmful, especially with repeated and prolonged exposure. So if you would not like to wear hearing aids in old age, please wear hearing protection. I am only going to briefly cover the chemical senses of taste and smell. They are called chemical senses because we sample molecules from the food and the air, and then a chemical reaction occurs to transduce the message to your brain. Smell and taste are tightly related. Much of taste relies heavily on smell. Some people say that they can almost taste certain smells. This is because the molecules that allow us to smell and taste attach to our sensory receptors. The receptors for taste are our taste buds. Taste is something that is easily classically conditioned. We will talk more about classical conditioning in the next chapter, but this is something that most people have experienced. Have you ever been so sick and ate something which you now don't like because you associate it with being sick? Or have you ever heard of someone drinking so much of a particular alcohol that they can no longer stand the sight or smell of it, never mind drink it? That is what we call a taste aversion. The receptors for smell are called cilia. Smell is the strongest sense tied to memory. Have you ever smelled something and had it remind you of something else? Some people's smell can trigger good and bad memories that can also cause a multitude of psychological effects. Finally, touch is the last sense we will be covering in this class. Touch is important to humans, but when it comes to psychology, there are not many relationships. The few relationships that do exist have to do with the perception of pain. Besides the perception of pain, we have sensory receptors for temperature, touch, and pressure. When it comes to psychology, the most relevant sensory receptor is the nociceptor, or pain receptor. Pain is a perception. Not all people experience pain in the same way. That is why when you go to the emergency room, they have charts of emoticons with numbers so that each individual can rate their own pain. If a broken leg was always a 9 on the pain scale, we would not need this. Pain perception is something that can be manipulated by the mind. In fact, in the military, they train soldiers to increase their pain tolerance through rigorous training. One of the most famous sayings in the Marines is, "If you don't mind, it don't matter." This training is meant to train soldiers to turn off these emotional centers in the brain that make the tolerance of pain more endurable. Some people actually enjoy pain. In the sexual disorder of masochism, an individual is sexually aroused by the experience of pain. It gives them a rush of endorphins and adrenaline that can sometimes give the person a natural high. This concludes the section on the questions in the senses. The next lecture, I will take you further and deeper into the rabbit hole. You will see how visual perception works and how visual illusions show us that the mind does not always see reality as it really is.